Hey everyone, how are you doing today?
Hello, Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are.
Hey there, George. How are you doing today?
Good, thank you. How are you, Brian?
Yeah, I'm very well. I'm suffering a little bit from communications issues today. My broadband provider decided it would be a great day to have a Most of Scotland outage. So apologies in advance for any technical issues from my side.
And I'm glad you clarified the communication issues were with your broadband supplier and not just because we have strong Scottish accents.
Oh, there could be any number of reasons, George, but that's the one that I'm going with. But it's been a while, mate. So how are you doing? How have you been?
I had my first venture into London last week, so things are starting to get back to normal, but I can tell you things have changed forever. I'm absolutely not going to be back in the office 5 days a week. I'm pleased about that. So I think is the environment, because my carbon footprint will now be significantly lower, which I'm also pleased about. I genuinely was feeling quite bad about the number of air miles that I got through in a year. So yeah, it's been busy. I'm looking forward to a week off next week. I have my 20th wedding anniversary coming up in 6 days' time. So Claire, my wife, and I are going away for a week on the west coast of Scotland. We didn't want to risk going abroad just in case something got red zoned and we had to scurry back.
Yeah.
So yeah, how about you, Brian?
Yeah, you don't want the last minute trip to be cancelled at the last minute. That would be bad. That would be bad. But it sounds like you've had a busy old time, mate. It's been a while since we've had the last episode 4, and in the interim, as you know, I've had COVID, and so have my family. So it's been an interesting time as well. More interesting actually is that my daughter is away for the whole of this week. She's at camp for the first time, and I know we were talking a couple of days ago about how they all grow up so fast. And you've got olders, obviously, but yeah, it's a bit strange. I'm on day 4 now, and the house is eerily quiet. So this is a welcome distraction while I wait for her to come home. So,
you've got empty nest syndrome.
Something like that, yeah. Something like that.
That's a great link into our guest today, because we have a digital ornithologist coming on any minute now. Did I get that right, Brian?
Absolutely savage, George. I absolutely loved that. Well done. That was a great segue.
I will apologise profusely when Caitlin arrives. No, Caitlin is a digital. Now I'm going to get time. She's not an ornithologist. She's an anthropologist.
I think what we should do is we should get Caitlin to clarify the situation, because no episode has gone this badly to begin with us getting our words wrong.
Kate, apologies. You have 2 dads on here, and the dad jokes just keep coming.
It was necessary to start off with. I was sitting there trying not to laugh because I wasn't sure if the audience could hear me. So hello, everyone. I am not an ornithologist by any means. I am an anthropologist. Really delighted to join you both today. And despite my not Scottish accent, I too am located in Scotland, and I'm very grateful not to be having the same broadband problems that Brian is this morning. So this afternoon even. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for coming.
It's fantastic, Caitlin. I know we've been round the houses a little bit, and it's been a bit of a pulled together thing over the last couple of days. But everyone's done their jobs, and we're here, and I'm still streaming, so this is a big success for me at the moment. But Caitlin, obviously we've got you on. Again, George and I make full admissions at the start of our shows, right? That we are not experts in any of the topics we investigate. And I think that's one of the cool things about the data mix is that we are almost as clueless as a man on the street when it comes to a lot of the things that we talk about. And we say that in the nicest possible way. So I wonder if you could spend just a little bit of time talking about the different gamuts of things that you are involved in and what you do. And I think you might have a few sort of lead-in slides for us to start the conversation about digital ethics, which is the...
I do, and actually, the slide that I cut that would have been really relevant to your situation today, Brian, which is, this is from a Nesta, which is the UK's innovation think tank, a survey that they did a few months ago, I'm going to say 3 or 4 months ago now, and it was for digital access in Scotland and Wales particularly, and I believe that they found that 16% of people in Scotland don't have sufficient data access to actually meet the day-to-day needs of their lives. And this is a huge issue from a digital ethics perspective, so we can get into some of that as we move forward. But I will go ahead and present some of those slides. So whoever is in charge of making them magically flash up, go ahead.
I will make that magic happen, hopefully. Here we go.
Amazing. I feel like the jazz hands also helps with that as well.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Awesome.
So if all is working, I should be able to move forward. Right. So I actually set a question in the promo video for this talk. So hopefully everybody who's listening has had a little think about what digital ethics question keeps you awake at night. And hopefully we can get into some of that as we start to get questions from the audience and things of that nature. So please do feel free to send your thoughts in. And also, George and Brian, if you've got things, spooky things that are keeping you up, let's talk about those too. But let's start with what a digital anthropologist is, not a digital ornithologist, because as far as I know, those don't exist. But if you are one, please write in and let us know. So basically, an anthropologist is someone who's extremely nosy about the way that people live their lives. And that can be in remote communities on the other side of the world, whatever that is, where you're from, or it can be right down the street, because actually culture is different wherever you go. And there are lots of things about culture that really define who we are and that we use to define the way that we interact with and relate to the world. And actually that is the smoking skeleton is there because it's the illustration from one of my very, very favorite articles, which is called Archaeology for Cyborgs. And it's by Jane Ruffino. And actually the painting is a Van Gogh. But it's a really great article, so I really encourage people to go and look it up. And the various other things that are on the slide are introductions to different ways that a digital anthropologist might think about assessing or measuring a community. So one of the techniques that we use is called network graphs, and that can tell you how closely knit or how dispersed a community is. And you can use digital techniques to do that, or you can even just do it on pen and paper. You can think about people that you know and the ways that you're connected, and you can draw a kind of map of what your life is like in that way. But the reason that this topic, digital ethics and data ethics, is so important to me is because almost everything that we do nowadays from a business perspective or just in your daily life is so driven by data. So if you're a business person, then almost everything that you work on will in some way be involved in a digital process. And if you think about it from the consumer perspective, I don't know about you, but I certainly really, really, really care that the data that I generate as a person is being used in a way that benefits me, that is fair, that is ethical. And this is hugely important. And I think that the thing is, as more and more processes get digitized, businesses really need to understand the ways that can impact the ethical decisions that they need to make, and not just hive it off on someone else or say, I don't need to think about that. It's someone else's job. Legal will take care of it, whatever it is. There are unique situations that emerge from the combination of digital technologies and business objectives that really mean that everybody needs to have a basic grasp of the kinds of ethical issues that can come out of those challenges. And I think I'm going to stop with the slides there. I have some more, but let's stop there for the intro and we can pick up the conversation and use the slides as needed.
Yeah. That was interesting, and that helped, because I thought a digital ornithologist was somebody who could tell me what happened to Flappy Bird. Remember Flappy Bird?
Yeah, Flappy Bird was good. Or Angry Birds also. That,
and Angry Birds
Twitter,
as well.
The current Angry Bird in everybody's life.
Okay, cool. Well, I did my homework. So last night I did have a think about what keeps me awake from a data ethics point of view. And actually, I think nothing kept me awake in the past. Now I'm awake because I was probably too blasé when it came to working with data, and now I think it's time for me to address that or redress that. So the answer to the question was it's now going to keep me awake, that it didn't keep me awake, wondering what ethics questions I had. Brian, did you do your homework?
I did do my homework, and you know what I realize is every day I use like password managers to manage my data because my brain is incapable of remembering passwords. And there's a couple of points I'd like to kick off with here. And the first one is like password repeatability, right? Because everyone's got passwords that they use for multiple different things over there. And it doesn't take much for someone, once they get one of your passwords, to unlock a lot of different stuff in your life. And people are sometimes quite remiss of that. But from the other side of things, I've realized how automated I have become in terms of password creation and password. I've liberally gone and trusted a company with all of my password data and said, okay, I do trust you, and I'm signing something that I'm saying I trust you to go and look after this and not do anything with it. But since we met, it has really made me think about, gosh, if I'm using several password managers, that means if any of them got cracked, all of my passwords for everything in the entire world would be available. And although it's verging into the area of black box testing and ethical hacking and that type of thing, it's an area that I really wanted to touch on about where you think the growth is in this area, because it's a huge area of growth in the IT industry about the security of data. So I wondered what your thoughts were on the kind of growth of that area to begin with.
I will answer that question, but actually, why don't we flip back to the slides for a second, and I'll show you a few of the things that keep me awake at night. So I'm sure you're familiar with some of the headlines. You've seen things where passport recognition is essentially racist. Twitter's had a problem with its image cropping algorithm, and actually, to give them their due credit, what they've subsequently done is they had a hackathon where they tried to address why the image cropping software was doing that and figure out how they could fix it. Other people might say that you could put the cropping more in the hands of the user, and that would also solve the problem. You didn't necessarily need to do it in an automated way, but that's a whole separate ethical issue. Facebook, various employees have come out and said that they feel responsible for some of the societal implications of things that have happened as a result of the kinds of conversations that happen both on Facebook and other platforms like Instagram they also own, and WhatsApp, for example. Healthcare, of course, again, racism right there, various kinds of discrimination happening in employment, but it's not all bad. So to take another example of where digital ethics can be a good thing, there was a situation, of course, we all had lockdown last year, and in several neighborhoods, as I mentioned, this headline wasn't in Scotland, this was from America, but school buses, which normally, of course, would be driving children to school, were sent out and they were parked in neighborhoods where kids didn't have enough internet access to actually do their homework or attend lessons. And that was a way of mitigating some of the inequalities that otherwise would have happened. So there are various things that keep me awake at night, but I want to have a moment of hope to say, actually, there are things that happen which are societal biases that actually digital technology can help uncover and actually overcome. So in some ways, digital technology, the fact that some of these challenges are coming up is actually reopening some existing societal biases that were already being experienced by people. And now the conversation can start again around, hey, actually, regardless of whether or not it was digital, there was already inequality happening in hiring, for example, in promotions. So this is a new way of reopening that conversation, which perhaps had been ignored for a long time. And we can stop sharing the slides now.
Yeah. And Caitlin, do you find that it's generally because humans have for example, trained algorithms on biased data to start with? Or is it just that there is the computer is just doing its logical thing, and actually it turns out that it's, I don't know if it's using pure logic to choose something. For example, and I don't mean any offense by this, but if you're trying to crop a black face on a black background or a white face on a white background, I think the algorithm is going to have more trouble with either of these than if it was, say, a black face on a white background. It would find that much easier. So what do you find? Is it humans making these algorithms biased?
That's such a great question. And just to be clear, those are not the kinds of examples that were happening. It was very clearly things like women's faces were getting cropped out in favor of their boobs. White politicians were showing up and excluding black politicians in photographs. So there was quite obvious. The example that you give is, I think we could all say, is there a computer imaging situation here? But this was actually almost a societally imprinted algorithmic problem, which they identified and are working to address. And actually, if we can pop the slides back up, I can talk a little bit about how bias, what we mean by bias. And in fact, this is a really great thesis of bias that Professor Julia Stoyanovich of the New York University Computer Science Department really helped to clarify some of my thinking on this, because she pointed out, when you talk to a data scientist or when you talk to a mathematician about bias, what they usually mean is statistical bias, meaning that within the data, just as you've described, George, there is some mismatch between the data that you have and the model that you've developed. So that there's, you can clearly see that there's a mismatch. But actually, often when people are talking about bias in general, so if I talk about something like, to mention a concept that's very much pre the digital age, redlining, which is a situation where informally, people of color were excluded from particular neighborhoods for housing. And that is one of the things that has led to the fact that, for example, in contemporary data sets, you can often guess somebody's race from their postcode or their zip code. Yeah. And that, of course, is a huge problem. But you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you had an understanding and an awareness of the way that those two things are socially linked. So if you just assume that zip codes are neutral or postcodes are neutral, they're not, in fact. They have other kinds of social data encoded in them. And what we would call that is societal bias. So does the data that we have actually represent the world correctly? Have we, for example, only used a very limited data set? And in fact, one of the major criticisms of the field of psychology as a whole is that often the experiments are run that we use and we accept as kind of general truths about life. They're often run at Western universities only using students who participate in these experimental classes or credits that they attend. And as a result of that, we have a fairly limited conception of life outside of that. So if you make assumptions that are statistically based, there are numbers backing these things up. But if you actually look at the population that's been used to create them, that's a fairly limited number of people. So I might call that a societal bias. And then you actually have another layer outside of all that, which is around societal fairness. And that question is the world that we have the one that we want? So even if I have a model that correctly, I can assume, I'm like, okay, well, now I know that there's a correlation between race and zip code. So, I could be a nefarious actor and I could use that to do all kinds of bad things. But equally, I could be somebody that says, I want a fairer world. So if I know that, then how can I use that to unlink those two things? How can I create a world where everybody has equal access to housing, for instance? And at that layer, you get into some really interesting questions about how could we use digital technology differently to create a fairer world.
Yeah. That's really interesting, because I think Brian, I hope would agree with me. In our trade, we've often had pushback from clients who look at data that we visualized for them, that we presented to them, and they'll screw their face up and say that's not my data, or I don't recognize that. And our stock answer was, well, the data doesn't lie. We've given you what was in your database. We've just visualized it. That's what you've got. But really, here, what I think you're almost inferring is that there now is a bit of a responsibility on people in our position to be looking more critically at the way that we are extracting data and processing that data, and then handing that back to our clients, or proposing solutions with that.
Yeah, and that's not even getting into the kind of bog standard issues of data cleanliness and, can we really trust that the data itself, never mind the model, that the data itself reflects the world that we all know and love and believe in, right? So I think let alone those things, once you start adding the kind of social and impact layer on it, then you get a whole different set of questions.
Yeah, because I think when I signed up to this job initially, the whole ethics side of things wasn't really talked about. That wasn't in my job description. But now it feels that there's almost a coming of age, a growing up that needs to be done. And everybody that is in any part of the data processing chain needs to be cognizant of the impact that they're having.
Mm-hmm.
I just to tie on to that, George, I think what's becoming a realization for me is that data ethics is one thing, but digital ethics is something else. And I think that's something that we see on the day-to-day as data ethics, or we come across those very types of practical issues where when we're getting data out, we have to ask questions about, should we get it out? Is it PII, GDPR, all these day-to-day types of questions. But what you're talking about is something much wider than that, and how not just how the impact, the bias impacts from a data side, and how we might interpret that data, but also how when it gets wider and out into the open world, the other things that can affect that as well. So I think George and I have a bit of a handle on the practicalities of data ethics from a very low level. But I think that's what's fascinating about this conversation, is that to see the social and business and economic and all of those types of aspects are not something that we are necessarily privy to in our roles. So,
yeah, it's a great point. And, in some ways, I actually think that a lot of broader digital ethics concepts really do relate to data ethics, because the real nitty gritty and nuts and bolts of how those impacts are carried out is through the way that data is stored, processed, collected. Who even decides what kind of data is worth collecting about people? What makes those things meaningful? On a kind of very fundamental existential level, that really creates value for a business, or doesn't, as the case may be. And as a result of that, those decisions really fundamentally affect our kind of societal relationships as well. And actually, I'm going to skip back a couple of slides and talk through one of them. So if you can shove them back up, Brian, that'd be great.
Sure.
And I think this is something, you raise a really important point, because often, as you say, especially if I get into conversations with kind of coalface data developers who are really focused on actually developing the applications that we use, as opposed to somebody who's in a managerial role or a strategic role, they often feel like those decisions aren't theirs to make. They're sort of the technical decisions. But the actual fundamental truth is that I think that everyone benefits from understanding fundamentally the way that their business thinks about the impact that it has, both on its customers and on people who may be impacted by their services that are not necessarily their customers. And certainly I speak to a lot of CIOs, CTOs, CEOs, and this is typically kind of how they think about the world. When they're making decisions about a business, they're either looking at things from a reputational perspective, a revenue perspective, or a regulatory perspective. So there's always going to be one of those things. And in fact, they interrelate quite closely, because, if I think about something like reputation, you might think that that's kind of a fluffy metric, but the reality is that if a business develops or an industry develops a particularly bad reputation around something, often a regulator will step in and say, hey, this isn't really how we want to run our society. We need to create something that's fair for everybody. And actually, especially when I think about some of the data ethics issues that we've been talking about already today, reputation can certainly dent your revenue if you're not careful. So, if I was a CEO, I would really be thinking about these things. And it works the other way as well. If you're perceived as a really good or valuable business, then not only can that be a differentiator and a selling point in the market for you, but also you can attract the best talent that way as well. Because as I was saying to you in one of our prep calls, a lot of people who work in data, and particularly in AI and some of the kind of crunchier and more exciting areas of data that are available today, they really do care about and want to work for businesses that align with their values. So there have been several surveys, both in the UK and in the US, that have been done about this. And a lot of people are saying, I really want to know that the work that I'm doing is going to be for societal good. And that's a value that I'm willing to put my career on the line for.
Yeah.
I think that's a tremendous point there, Caitlin. And I think just to touch on one of the R's, the 3 R's there, reputation, I think a lot of exposure I've had to reputation in terms of business has been over like very sort of high level metrics like net promoter score and stuff like that. So how are you dealing with a client, and what kind of relationship have you had with them? How do you feel that you've been dealt with? But I think the point that you've raised is fascinating, because how much of that is based on ethical behaviour, and I would probably take a guess at almost zero of that type of comparison coming through in terms of net. That's not really what that score is there to address, but it does raise another question, in that should we be engaging our clients more to understand how, A, that we work ethically in terms of the way that we use data, and B, what is their perception of that? That seems like a whole other type of stream that could be measured. And as you say, in terms of the practicalities of business, really elevating your business from a corporate social responsibility type of level to make sure that you're doing the ethically correct thing. Because as leaders in the data analytics and business intelligence sectors, or we like to think we've got a bit of a voice here anyway, these are the things that we should be proponents of publicly as well, and not just privately within business, but publicly online. And that's one of the great things about the platform that the data mix gives us, to be able to talk about these things. But I think you've hit on a really fascinating side of things there that maybe a lot of businesses haven't considered. And have you seen?
And actually, Brian, to pick up on that point, there are ways in which this is already starting to happen. So if you look at something like B Corp, which are specific businesses that are not from a data ethics perspective necessarily, but from a broader ESG social responsibility perspective, not only have they signed up, of course, like every private business, to have revenue goals, they also have agreed to achieve certain things with respect to climate, planet, equality, and various other things that they sign up for. So that's one way that businesses are starting to differentiate themselves, and consumers are looking for that. Another example would be, there already are some services that do things like algorithm auditing to make sure that you're being fair. Big, large consultancies, all the names that you already know, they're doing them. Smaller consultancies, people like Kathy O'Neill, who wrote the excellent book, Weapons of Math Destruction. She set up her own consultancy to do that kind of thing. So I'd say these kinds of impacts are already starting to happen. And if you think about something like an analogous case, like the organic kite mark, so think about, 20 years ago, was that really big? Not hugely, but now people really look for that, and that's actually changed not only the kind of organic industry, but broader attitudes to food and food production. And if you think about data in the same way, you could have a similar impact, just like you were saying, Brian, by pushing for, how do we differentiate ourselves? How do we show that we really are good at this?
Yeah, but then I guess there's also, once you've got that data, you've sourced that data ethically, you have that data, but you can then be unethical with that ethical data. So I come from a management consultancy background, and I know we've got quite a few listeners who come from management consultants area. Most of them will have heard about the McKinsey opioid scandal in the US. They were just fined £600 million, really for being too good at their job. They got all of that data, they analyzed that data, they got that data ethically, and then they used that data to target the types of people that were more likely to buy more drugs from CVS, from all of the main pharmacies in the US, and so I think every management consultant's now heard that story, because that's a cautionary tale. Recently, this year, we were working for a charity, and we were analysing the types of givers that donate to this charity, and it turned out the best donations came from people who had terminal illnesses, were very close to end of life, and the charity wanted to go. Once we presented the data, they said, "That's it. We need to go and ask them for legacies." And these are the people we'll target. And we thought, well, wait. We need to put some ethics over that now. And backpedaling, we're now considering checks and balances as to when we find that kind of data, is it responsible for us to give that information to the client if we feel that they might not meet the same value as us? With it. So there's all these difficult questions that we're coming up to now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, in the first example, you might make the argument that actually knowing that the ultimate societal impacts that those addictions were going to have, was that really an ethical use of the data? Whereas if I look at the charity, it's a bit more of a mixed bag, right? Because on the one hand, that money will be going to do good things. On the other hand, it is really opportunistic, isn't it, to target people at the end of their lives to give more money. And so I think that, there's a real, you can, whether you are a deliberately bad actor or not, you can certainly participate in things that cause harm. And that is a great question, George. And I think that there are ways that you can design systems that cause you to ask those questions before you even generate the data set. So you could do things like, okay, you want to look at who are the biggest donors. Let's consider a few what-if scenarios, or let's consider other metrics that we might want to include by having an overall ethical donor strategy. So because the other fact I happen to know is often the larger share of donations by income are from people who earn far, far less, right? So if you think about things like what's the impact of that overall on society, and do you really want to encourage people to be giving even more of their income to charity? Not that would be a bad decision as an individual, but is that really the strategy I would want to pursue as a person who is creating a strategy for this? Well, could we perhaps look not only at that, but also at what other kinds of mechanisms do we want to change in society? So, if we were perhaps at the start of this project say, well, we don't really want to push vulnerable people, then what would that mean? So how do we even think about that before we even get started? So,
yeah. I think that really hits a chord with me, because I have members of my family who have been involved in charities and events in charities, and they come across these ethical issues all the time, that people have, for example, had people in their family that have been part of this charity for many, many generations. And for a long time, it was assumed that because of that inheritances would just flow towards the charities, and there weren't really as many checks in terms of the way that type of thing was going to happen. It was just sort of assumed, you could say, is this data ethics or is it ethics itself? But I think as the world starts to become more digital, all of those assumptions, again, you think pre-GDPR, all the boxes that would have been ticked before GDPR that says, when you turn 90, you agree that if you die, you're going to pass 50% of your inheritance over to said charity. Again, that's the kind of thing that needs governed in the best possible way, if you like. And I think it's really an interesting point to hit on. I think what I'd like to do, Caitlin, now is take a little pause from our discussion, because I see a couple of things I've covered in the chat. And again, I just want to remind everyone who's watching live right now, this is our underlying topic here. What data ethics questions are keeping you awake at night? So do keep dropping us those lines in the chat as well. But we have had a few responses here, so I just wanted to get your thoughts on those, Caitlin, as we go. So I have an idea. I think I might know who this person is, but issues that keep me awake: surveillance capitalism. So I'm guessing that this is around the area of we are being watched all the time from a commercial and a centralized and a governmental standpoint. And we've all seen the scandals that have been around COVID, like the health secretary losing his job because of his post-marital affairs. But again, you have to ask the question, how did that data get into the public domain? Who sanctioned that those got leaked to the press? Was it intentional? Was it not? I mean, it's a whole data ethical can of worms, if you like. So what are your thoughts on that kind of general topic of centralized capitalism and surveillance and around that in terms of data?
And just before you start, Caitlin, can I just add into that? Have you seen Aws Recognition? I had to play with that tool a couple of weeks ago. That's able to pull out things like sentiment. It's got facial recognition built in, of course. It's able to tell ethnicity, your propensity to purchase something if you're in a shop, just by analyzing the way you're walking around the shop. All of that information we can access right now via a login to AWS and their recognition API. So it's there now. We can start playing with that, but it's scary. Scary.
Let me address that one right off. So I sometimes, when I present slides, I use this slide of an old-fashioned phrenology head, because actually a lot of the claims around those kinds of things that are made nowadays really bear no relation to any actual science. And they might be saying we can recognize sentiment, but think about, just in general, your own experience as a person trying to read the sentiment of someone else. Do you think a machine is going to be better than you at doing that? And some people are going to be out there saying, yes, of course. But the reality is, and actually, a lot of the objection to some of those kinds of tools is it unfairly disadvantages particular groups of people because, for example, it doesn't recognize them as well. So then they are consistently placed on watch lists or risk lists that are unnecessary. If I have a facial tic, how is recognition going to treat me? If I have a slightly different way, or if I have a droop or something like that, let alone all of the ethnicity and racial issues that we've already seen, those things are, in my view, should not be used. And in fact, many places have now put bans on police using those kinds of technologies, which I think is the right move. But also, thanks for putting that slide up, Brian. This is a really important thing that I want to say to everybody, is that you don't have to feel like you're alone, or that there's no work out there on this, or that you have to do it from scratch. There are a lot of tools available to you, whether that's a more conceptual tool, which is something like the data ethics framework, which the UK government has developed, which is the bottom right there, or something that's more specifically technological. There are actually a lot of tools right now that you can plug in just as you would any other software library that will assess fairness in a machine learning workflow. These ones tend to be more conceptual, the ones that are on the slide, but just be aware there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of data ethics and digital ethics strategies and tools available. So please don't feel like you have to face it alone.
Yeah, I think that's key. That tooling is something that touches every part of our data world, right? So on a practical scale, George and I use tooling for all kinds of things every day, and you might even argue that, again, that's a whole data ethics conversation in itself. Which of these tools are we using for our own personal use, our own business use? Where are we inadvertently mixing the two, even if we might not be meaning to do it? I think a lot of the businesses that I'm working with at the moment are going through a lot of security and audit to understand that, and that this is I do want to talk about this kind of big brother scenario that is coming into our world more and more, that when you're in a business wants to know more and more about what you're doing, like what you have installed, how you're using your time, what you're sending by email. Now, that's not to say everyone's watching every moment of your day, but how many people actually understand the recognition of what they're signing in a contract and what that allows a business to look at in terms of an entity. And I think, just touching on what George was talking about with the AWS technology, what happens when you sign up to being a part of not just manual checking, but automated checking that starts flagging stuff that you are doing in an automated way back to people that you are working for or with. I think it's a pretty dangerous area that we're walking into, and I'm not sure we're doing it with our eyes open a lot of the time. So have you seen any kind of examples of that recently, and the way that has been evolving over time?
Yeah, let me give 2 examples. And the first one that came to mind as you were talking, Brian, and this is an example both from a terrible digital ethics perspective and also just like a regular technical skills perspective. I was at a meeting of CIOs, and one of them was talking about the challenges of people wanting to bring their own devices. And they told the story about an employee who had installed some work-related software on their device that became in some way compromised. And so so work automatically deleted everything on their phone, including all of their personal photos. And I was like, hang on a second. I have a lot of problems with that because, first of all, do you think that the employee really did, as you said, Brian, actually know what they were signing up for? Secondly, if you expect people to have a phone, you should issue that to them. That's an ethics issue of its own because not everybody has the money to buy a second phone for work, etc. And thirdly, actually, you can partition devices. So, as a CIO, if you don't know that, I am really concerned about the state of your business from a digital perspective. So that was a kind of really revealing moment. But the second thing I wanted to talk about, Brian, and this is, let me tell a slightly hopeful story because I have really mixed feelings about this. I think we all kind of have realized now that most social media tools or any kind of attention-getting tools that we use really want our attention. I mean, I'm not ascribing actual agency to them. They don't really want it. It's the designers and developers that have created systems that are, they use the dopamine centers in our brain to keep us paying attention. You get a ping, you go, ooh, you get a ping, you get excited. It just keeps happening over and over. And you are hardwired to respond to those kinds of attention grabbing techniques. So it's very hard unless we change the design of these things to turn it off or look away. And what I really respect Microsoft doing is that they actually have created this new couple of things. One of them is it sends you, I don't know that everybody's workplace has this, but they have one of the techniques they use is they'll send you an email every couple of weeks to say, hey, did you actually switch off? Because we noticed that you worked these hours and there was quite a lot of meetings and you didn't really get any focus time. So they've been quite good about helping people be really reflective about how they're using their time, which I think is quite good. On the other hand, there are some challenges to that as well. And as a researcher, I'm immediately like, but Microsoft, you only know when I'm working within Microsoft products. So all the time that I'm spending doing this podcast, for example, I'm not being recorded as working, right? So, if my boss is really depending on my Microsoft score to figure out whether I'm working or not, then, I'm not going to do so well right now. And so I think that there are some real, if we kind of just trust that the technology is going to do what it says on the tin and, actually be the be all end all, then we have a real problem. But there are ways that we can use it to actually help us. So
I think that focus time is a tremendous example because it's an effort to bridge the gap, I think, from the technology companies, because they can't be seen just as march in and say, we're going to observe everything that you're doing. But what they can do is observe enough of what you're doing to give you a prompt to say, are you being ethical to yourself? And are you giving yourself a chance to not be run down and not have too much work in your day, and give yourself time where you can turn off the dopamine pings and actually focus on other stuff? I can tell you that I have no dopamine pings at the moment because my phone is hanging out of that window right there to facilitate this call because of the broadband outage. But there you go. And I think there's one thing I want to do, Caitlin, that's bring up another comment that we've had in the chat here, because we had another response to your question. Just wanted to get your thoughts on it as well. So Blaze has come in with it. What keeps me awake is how AI algorithms can unintentionally contain biases. Now, George, this is a subject that we touched on quite a bit with Claudio in a previous episode. But Caitlin, what would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the unconscious bias issue is really getting a lot of attention, and it's both, I think. And some people will say, oh, it's only that if you're using the wrong data where it's a problem. So if you just leave out the bad data, then you won't have a problem. And it's like, well, actually, from the example I gave earlier, where you can correlate postcodes to race, among other demographic things about you, even if you leave that data out, if you don't have any data about race in the data set, you can still have biased things that come out of that data set. And there are a lot more insidious examples, but that one I think people can readily grasp. So it's not just the algorithms themselves, it's also the actual data. But actually, yes, you have to think about, and some of this stuff is like so basic. There were things like Apple Watch when it first came out. It had facilities because, of course, it can measure skin galvanic response and things. So it would track your pulse. You could track, I think, something like your zinc levels, but it wouldn't track a woman's period. And that was like, really, guys? Like, did you not think about half the market that you have? So there are some basic things you can do by involving stakeholders. So depending on, who's involved in using your product or even being affected by people that might use your product, you can really avoid some of these kind of very basic issues, so.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think the other topic I just wanted to mention is a lot of things seem to be tied into one thing, and that is consent, right? So the things that you're talking about there, again, with the Apple Watch is a great example. What can it do and what can't it do? And what do you sign up for when you buy an Apple Watch because you bought it and you've got the bit of paper inside and that says you agree to all of this stuff? And I think, consent is something that on the coalface we deal with every day in terms of more and more boxes are being put in front of us before we can proceed with things. But it's the crossover with the implicit nature, and how do you graduate from that implicit nature to make it very explicit? Because the world is becoming more explicit for everything and everything that we do. And that
totally. And the other thing about that, I think, Brian, which is really important, is you can ask for consent, but you have to also know that people understand what you're asking for. And I think this is a piece where, to me, this is the difference between transparency in an algorithm and explainability. And often people say, oh, those are the same thing. And I'm like, well, they're not really, because, you can have a very technical explanation of how something works. But, the person who's being impacted by that has absolutely no idea how it works. And the other thing, I think, is we assume that consent is always freely given. But the reality is, if my employer asks me to do something like have a credit check before I come to work for them, for instance, am I really going to say no to that? Because you don't have a choice. So if my employer asks me to keep particular monitoring software on while I'm working, or various other things that they might do, do I really have a choice? I've ticked the box, but have I done that with a kind of free and clean conscience of having a way to opt out? And actually, this is, to me, is one of the primary ethical issues, is that people say, oh, if you don't like the fact that things are monitoring you, then you can just not use those services. But the reality is you actually can't in a lot of cases, and I'm talking about the basics of banking, the basics of access to services, the basics of access, if you're a person who depends on various types of public funding or public access to services. A lot of the things you simply can't do nowadays because people have become so focused on digitization that there often are no replacements for people who actually don't have that access. And as we mentioned earlier, lots of people don't have sufficient access to access those things. So
yeah,
we have to be really mindful.
And Caitlin, do you think there's now with the younger generation? So I see my kids just freely giving their information away in return for shiny apps, for new features, for updates every week. I don't think either of them have got into TikTok that I know, but they certainly both are Instagram users, and I'm always horrified at just how much of their information they will freely give away without a second thought. And that almost seems to be their currency. They'll give away their information. They don't want to pay for these apps, but they'll give their information away in return for an app.
It's such a great question, because on the one hand, I too am horrified by how much we freely give away nowadays. And on the other, as an anthropologist, I look at that and I say, what's really happening here is that societal norms about privacy are changing. And we simply may have to accept that people think differently as the new generation goes forward. And that's not to say that all young people have cavalier attitudes to privacy. I think a lot of young people actually are very concerned about how that data is being used and what might be known about them. So I think we'll have to kind of wait and see how it shakes out. And nor is it just young people. I think lots of people just tick the box and say, yes, I consent to whatever, just to get me past this stupid modal window, So I think it's a really, there's kind of a tension there, I think. On the one hand, if society really does change, then how does that change the way that we approach these types of interactions? Do we want to create more friction, more privacy, or do we want to say, actually, nobody cares anymore? And a lot of business users would be really happy if we said we don't care anymore, but actually a lot of people still do. So it's I think it's still worth defending.
There's always the problem of the bad actors. And, for example, I know the NHS has got far more information than I'm comfortable with. The government's got far more information than I'm comfortable with. Even my bank has got more information than I'm comfortable with. But you learn to live with that and accept it. And then as somebody that works with data, I actually think, well, if I could join all that data together and get sort of lineage between things and then just be able to track somebody's entire life, think of the amazing things that that you could do. And then there are so many ethical issues with this. But whenever I go to my GP will read, I don't know, there's a little box on my medical notes that they'll read. That by no means gives the entire history, and that doctor for me is usually different every time I go, and there's no way that doctor knows who they're dealing with, other than sort of key information that's sort of put in that red box on the front page. But if you had an algorithm that was reading that, and then you could enter in, okay, what are George's symptoms this week? It's okay, I'm not a hypochondriac, but what are George's symptoms this week? And then there would be some intelligent responses. Well, it could be this, this, or this. And then you have a human, a GP, a trained person there sort of having that augmented help. But wow, the more information you could feed that, the more accurate it's going to be. But there's a lot of ethical issues to get over there.
And so actually, you raise a really important point. Yeah, you raise a really important point, George, around even when we have all this data, are we actually using it? And that's not to discount the fact that just because it's not being used now doesn't mean that a nefarious actor might not come and pick it up in the future. And in fact, I think the recent scare around Palantir perhaps coming to do some NHS data processing, which ultimately so far hasn't panned out that way, because so many people were very vocal about saying these are not people that we want handling public data, or in fact, private patient data for a public service like the NHS, because we just don't believe that they really have our best interests at heart. And I'm not saying that Palantir by any means is not good at what they do. They are excellent at data processing, but are they really people that we want working on our behalf? I think is a question that has been raised. And I think that gives me hope, again, to Brian's point about people do still care about privacy, actually.
Yeah, I agree they do. I mean, I was listening to a story yesterday. It was another podcast, actually, where we were talking about TikTok and the fact that there was a sporting challenge on TikTok that had pretty much every soldier in Afghanistan, every American soldier in Afghanistan, doing 20 push-ups and recording themselves doing 20 push-ups. And of course, they tagged themselves and they uploaded it. All of a sudden, ByteDance has the exact location of every military personnel in Afghanistan at that exact point. And, that doesn't just go for military personnel, that can go for all sorts of
well, and that's also, it's been a problem previously with like running apps and stuff that share your the runs that you've done, and people mapping military bases through that, for example, or what was the other one? Pokemon Go. People playing Pokemon Go.
Wow, that's a good one.
Yeah. So yeah, like you're right. That is a challenge. It's a really huge challenge, and there are all these things that come out. But to your point as well, George. I'm always torn between, hey, actually, we have way more data than we're ever going to use. And so, I'd love to believe in an AI that would magically solve all those problems. But the reality is, when you get right down to it, an AI is no different from any other computer program. It processes stuff. It sorts things. It labels things. It might make some recommendations about things. But the reality is, it's just like any other program. And so to believe that it's going to do anything that's more exciting than what you have to hand is, maybe we actually just want less data in some ways.
Yeah, that would be something. I don't know if I want to go backwards though. And I feel like
I'm not saying I want to go back to the time where we didn't have, the medical advancements that we have. And there are some cases where it's actually quite useful. So for instance, if you think about medical imaging processing, for instance, you can process things a lot faster, and that actually has a huge, huge value. But there are a lot of examples where the data that we capture, we think more is going to be better, and then actually it turns out that relevant is better, not necessarily more overall.
Yeah. Brian, do you remember I think it was the 2019 Click Connections conference, where Click actually rebranded what AI meant. AI didn't, to them, AI was not artificial intelligence. It was augmented intelligence.
Yes.
Exactly. Because you could never take the human out. The human element will always need to be there, even if it was a fully autonomous algorithm. A human created it. So it was always the human element was always going to be there. And actually that sort of rebranding of AI or retilting of it gave me quite a bit of comfort. And I think if we start talking more about, the computers are there to help us. They can churn through, thousands of pages of medical records, and then compare your history with somebody that's similar, anonymously, of course, and then maybe start pulling together some ideas or prompts for the doctor to then say, okay, it's more likely to be this. And I think then that's a good way of using data and all of the data that we've got to sort of positive ends.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's about that judgment. Oh, sorry, Brian, you go ahead.
That's okay. I just really wanted to sort of augment that point and say that it's ultimately, right, it's a personal choice, and it's where your threshold lies personally. There's two sides of it. There's what are people doing with the data that you cannot control, and what about your own attitude to data and ethics, right? And that's everything that we're talking about to me is a great thing, because it's widening, hopefully, the understanding of what people understand as data ethics. And you know what? If they're comfortable pressing accept all cookies, and if they're comfortable whenever they, buy a pack in FIFA that something random gets sent off to someone on the other side of the world, you know what? That's okay. I think that's okay, and that's what we need to remember, is that we'll never be able to eradicate it. It's one of these things that's an evolutionary process, and we're only going to be able to make small indents in it. And I think we all have to be realistic and pragmatic about that data is going to circulate forever going forwards. I think about the practical example of today when my internet went down. What did I have to do? I had to go and find a provider for a SIM card, pass over all my details because I was in a situation in a spot to get data to be able to do something. So it's all connected, and not every, as you rightly pointed out, Caitlin, there is hope because not everything that we do with data is nefarious, and not everything that we do is under the hood and not to be seen or talked about before. And I think that is really encouraging in that there is more data, but that also means there's more visibility of that data, and people such as yourselves do an incredible job making that a reality. I think those are all really valid things at this point. And what I think is, I can see that we're kind of running up on time a little bit. So I did want to ask you, Caitlin, how did you end up in this field where you get to have these fascinating conversations all day long?
Thank you. It's been great talking to you both. This has been really interesting. I ended up in this field. So my doctorate is actually in Middle East studies, which is perhaps in some ways you might think totally different to this. But a lot of what I was doing was I was really looking at the way that online communities connect around things of interest. In my case, it was music and dancing, and how do they, as global citizens, connect with each other. And so I became very, very interested in the way that social media in particular was facilitating, or in some cases hindering, people's ability to connect around subjects of interest. And that became of huge value, as I'm sure you know. If you think about web metrics, web economics, obviously people are really interested in how do we get audiences, how do we keep them interested in what we're doing. So that was where my career started, actually. I was in looking at an education website and how do we make sure that teachers are interested in what we've got and are connecting with each other and being really active. And then I just took it from there, really. And I think the personal interest in data ethics is just, as I mentioned earlier, we all really should be concerned about this stuff because it impacts all of our lives all the time, so we have to really think about, and I think those of us that work in the industry have a special responsibility to think about how can we act as ambassadors for people who don't necessarily have the skills or the understanding to really know how to ask for the things that they need to ask for.
Again, I think I'm kind of in awe, Caitlin, because I think that it's quite a thing to take on to try and guide people in this type of topic. It's one thing for us to say that we know the mechanics of tools and BI-related processes or whatever, but it's completely different to step into an arena where ethics is such a prevalent issue on a day-to-day basis. So it's absolutely fascinating for us to hear that as well.
Super. Yeah, Brian, would you mind just flashing up one last slide, just in case people want further reading and resources? There's a couple of things they can go check out that I've worked on before. We did a podcast series where I work for this, and we wrote a paper. So I'm happy to circulate the slides as well for people to use, but it's called Growing Digital Ethics in Practice, an Interactive Roadmap. And if you Google that, you should be able to find the paper that we wrote.
Fantastic. And I'm so pleased.
That's fantastic. And we'll be happy to drop the link. George, on you go.
So there's obviously a little bit of a lag here, but no, Caitlin, I'm just really pleased that there are people like you actually putting thought into this and helping to make the world a better place. It's certainly got me thinking, and I will certainly be changing some of my behaviors based on this. I think the most powerful one was the almost a what if, and thinking through the consequences of. Beforehand, before we actually do any data cuts or stuff with data, we maybe need to actually bring that in as a sort of policy where we do some upfront checking.
Well, you can even do what's the worst possible, worst use of this potential use of this data that you can think of? What's the Black Mirror use that somebody might use this data for? And that can be a really helpful way of thinking. Not that most of those scenarios will end up that badly, but it can really help you start to think, okay, if this is the worst scenario, then what are some more likely scenarios that might happen?
I think that's a great way to handle things. And look, we're just coming up on the hour now, and I have to say, Caitlin, I mean this absolutely genuinely. I've really enjoyed this last hour. It's opened a lot of eyes for me in areas that I just haven't even thought about in any kind of depth before. So thank you so much for coming on and your expertise. George, some closing comments from you as well?
I think just to echo what you said, Brian, that has been probably the most interesting 1 hour conversation I've had in a long time. I still have so many questions, so Caitlin, don't be surprised if we ask you to come on again in the future. I think there's quite a few areas that we can still sort of tap. But thank you very much for your time. That's given a lot to think about.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.
Fantastic. Thanks, Caitlin. And so the Data Mix episode 5 in the books with Caitlin McDonald. We've had a great time here. We don't have our episode 6 guest quite lined up yet, but we'll be sure to let you know on all the usual channels. But it just remains for me and George and Caitlin to say thank you once again for taking the time out to come and view the show today. We'll get it all up on LinkedIn, YouTube, and all that good stuff later on. But have a great weekend, everyone, a great Friday and weekend, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Data Mix. Goodbye. See you soon.
Thank you.